Introduction. They weren't trying to change the world. They were solving small problems, cleaning up spills, fixing machines, or just experimenting with something strange. But in the process, they stumbled onto discoveries that reshaped how we live, eat, move, and communicate. These are the inventions no one meant to create, but that changed everything. Let's explore the unexpected accidents that built our modern world. Safety glass. In the early 20th century, glass was everywhere, in car windshields, in store windows, in homes. But it was also dangerously fragile. When shattered, it would explode into sharp, deadly shards. Accidents involving broken glass caused serious injuries and even deaths. Yet, despite its obvious dangers, little had been done to make glass safer, until a moment of pure accident changed everything. The story begins in 1903, in the laboratory of a French chemist named Edouard Benedictus. Benedictus wasn't working on glass at all. In fact, his research focused on cellulose nitrate, a type of early plastic used in photographic film. One day, while reaching for something in his lab, he accidentally knocked over a glass flask that had been sitting on a high shelf. The flask fell to the ground, but to his surprise, it did not shatter into 100 dangerous pieces. Instead, it cracked but held together in its original shape. Curious, Benedictus examined the flask and discovered that the interior was coated with a thin film of dried cellulose nitrate. The chemical had adhered to the glass, holding it together even after the impact. The structure of the glass had changed. It was still broken, but the danger of sharp edges had been removed. This accident might have been forgotten had it not been for a seemingly unrelated event. Shortly after the incident, Benedictus read a newspaper report describing a car accident in which a passenger was severely injured by shards of glass from the windshield. Struck a chord. He recalled the flask in his lab, broken but safe. That's when the idea took shape. If glass could be made to hold together upon impact, it could save lives. Motivated by the potential, Benedictus began experimenting. He layered glass sheets with cellulose nitrate, refining the process to create what would later become known as laminated safety glass. His method involved bonding two sheets of glass with a transparent plastic layer in between, which held the glass fragments in place when shattered. In 1909, he patented his invention under the name triplex glass. Initially, the technology didn't find wide acceptance. The automotive industry, still in its infancy, wasn't interested in adopting new materials that added cost or complexity. But World War I changed that. As military demand for safer materials increased, laminated glass was used in the lenses of gas masks and vehicle windshields. Its ability to remain intact under pressure made it invaluable. By the 1920s and 30s, car manufacturers began to adopt safety glass more broadly, especially as automobiles became faster and more dangerous in collisions. What began as an accident in a chemistry lab had turned into a life-saving innovation adopted worldwide. Today, safety glass is not only a standard in cars but also in skyscrapers, bus stops, bank counters, and countless other places where human safety is at risk. The original principle remains the same: glass reinforced with an internal layer to prevent dangerous breakage. Edouard Benedictus may not have set out to revolutionize safety engineering, but his curiosity, timing, and recognition of a problem outside his immediate field made it possible. A simple broken flask, and the decision not to ignore it, laid the groundwork for one of the most important safety inventions of the modern world. Microwave oven. In 1945, in a laboratory belonging to the Raytheon Corporation in Massachusetts, engineer Percy Spencer was conducting radar experiments. He was working on magnetrons, vacuum tubes that produced the microwaves used in radar systems. The world was still recovering from the aftermath of World War II, and radar technology had played a crucial role during the conflict. Now, in peacetime, scientists like Spencer were exploring how these wartime innovations might serve civilian life. Spencer was known among his colleagues for his intuition with electronics. He had no formal college education, but he had risen to become one of Raytheon's top engineers. On that particular day, he was standing near an active magnetron when he noticed something odd. A chocolate bar in his pocket had melted. Not just softened, it had liquefied completely. The room was not hot. The only plausible source of energy was the magnetron itself. Spencer didn't dismiss the event as a coincidence. Instead, he conducted a simple test. He placed popcorn kernels near the magnetron tube. Moments later, they popped and scattered across the floor. Encouraged, he moved on to an egg. He placed it in a metal kettle and aimed microwaves at it. The egg exploded in the face of a curious colleague. These observations, while crude, revealed something remarkable. Microwave energy could cook food. And not by heating the air around it, as in conventional ovens, but by exciting water molecules inside the food itself, causing heat to build internally. Cooking from the inside out, Spencer quickly began to develop a more controlled environment for this energy. With Raytheon's support, he built the first microwave cooking box. It was a heavy, refrigerator-sized machine, with water-cooled magnetrons and thick shielding to contain the radiation. Despite its bulk and complexity, it worked. Food placed inside cooked rapidly. In 1946, Raytheon filed a patent for a microwave cooking process. By 1947, the company released the first commercial microwave oven, the Raytheon. It stood nearly 6 feet tall, weighed over 300 kilograms, and cost several $1,000s. It was intended for restaurants, ships, and industrial kitchens rather than home use. The early reception was cautious. Microwaves were unfamiliar and even frightening. Myths spread that they could make food radioactive or damage human tissue. But over time, as the technology was refined and the size and price of microwave ovens dropped, acceptance grew. By the late 1960s and early 70s, microwave ovens became smaller and more affordable. With the rise of the fast-paced lifestyle in modern cities, their speed and convenience appealed to consumers. By the 1980s, the microwave had transformed from a scientific curiosity into a staple of the American kitchen. The principle behind it remains simple. Electromagnetic waves at a frequency of around 2.45 gigahertz cause water molecules in food to vibrate, generating heat through friction. There are no open flames or heating elements, just invisible energy, controlled and directed. Today, the microwave oven is a fixture in homes, offices, and dorm rooms across the globe. It heats meals in seconds, defrosts ingredients, and even cooks full recipes. All thanks to a bar of chocolate that melted unexpectedly in an engineer's pocket. Percy Spencer never set out to revolutionize cooking. His focus was military radar. But he had the presence of mind to investigate something small and unusual. From that single observation, an entire industry was born. It was not the invention itself that changed the world, but the recognition of possibility in a moment of chance. X-rays. In the winter of 1895, in a modest laboratory at the University of Würzburg in Germany, a physics professor named Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen was conducting experiments with cathode ray tubes. These glass tubes, evacuated of air and filled with electrical components, were at the center of intense scientific interest. When electrified, they emitted rays of unknown nature, invisible beams that fascinated physicists seeking to understand the basic forces of the universe. Röntgen was an experienced experimentalist. At 50 years old, he had spent decades studying the behavior of light and energy. On that particular evening in November, he had enclosed one of the cathode ray tubes in a black cardboard box, aiming to prevent light from escaping while he measured its behavior more precisely. The laboratory was darkened. When he activated the current, something unexpected occurred. Several feet away, he noticed a faint green glow on a screen coated with barium platinocyanide, a fluorescent material. The glow persisted even though the tube was entirely sealed off. Röntgen was perplexed. Whatever was causing the screen to light up was not ordinary visible light, nor was it the known cathode rays, which could not pass through the heavy black cardboard. Intrigued, Röntgen began experimenting. He placed various objects between the tube and the screen: books, wooden blocks, sheets of metal. Many of them were transparent to this mysterious new energy. Only denser substances like lead appeared to block it. Even more astonishingly, when he placed his hand in front of the screen, he saw the outline of his bones projected in glowing contrast against the soft shadow of his flesh. It was a revelation. He had discovered a new kind of ray, invisible, penetrating, and capable of revealing the internal structure of solid objects. He called them X-rays, using the mathematical symbol X to denote the unknown. For several weeks, Röntgen worked in secret. He wanted to understand this phenomenon fully before announcing it to the world. He studied the rays' behavior, documented their properties, and began capturing images, what we now call radiographs. One of the first he produced was a haunting skeletal image of his wife's hand. The photograph showed not just bones, but the shadow of her wedding ring, a clear testament to the power of this new discovery. When Röntgen finally published his findings in December 1895, the scientific community was astonished. Within weeks, newspapers around the world carried stories of this invisible light that could see through flesh and wood. The public was equally fascinated and disturbed. There were sensational headlines, speculating that privacy itself might be under threat. But the practical uses became apparent almost immediately. Within months, physicians began using X-rays to locate bullets, fractures, and foreign objects inside the human body. The battlefield medicine of World War I would not have been the same without them. Surgeons were now able to operate with precision, guided by a non-invasive window into the body. Interestingly, Röntgen refused to patent his discovery. He believed that the knowledge belonged to science and to humanity. His humility earned him admiration, and in 1901, he became the first recipient of the Nobel Prize in Physics. But not all consequences of the discovery were immediately understood. At the time, the dangers of radiation exposure were unknown. Early radiologists, fascinated by the new technology, would often expose themselves repeatedly to X-rays without protection. It would take decades before the risks of prolonged radiation became clear, leading to the development of protective shielding and strict medical protocols. Still, the fundamental nature of Röntgen's invention remains unchanged. More than a century later, X-rays continue to be one of the most widely used tools in medicine, engineering, and security. They are used to detect diseases, inspect the integrity of materials, and even scan luggage in airports. The basic principle, the ability of high-energy waves to pass through some substances and be absorbed by others, remains as powerful and relevant today as it was in 1895. Wilhelm Röntgen's discovery did not arise from a deliberate search for a new technology. It was the result of curiosity, careful observation, and a willingness to follow the evidence where it led. The cathode ray tube had been studied by many, but it was Röntgen who noticed something no one else had seen, and who pursued it with quiet persistence. In many ways, X-rays opened the first true window into the invisible. Before their discovery, the interior of the human body was a mystery unless surgically opened. With X-rays, the boundary between surface and structure was blurred. Medicine, science, and even the way we understand the world would never be the same. Velcro. In the summer of 1941, in the alpine countryside of Switzerland, a man walked with his dog through fields and brush. His name was George de Mestral, a Swiss electrical engineer and amateur inventor. The walk itself was unremarkable, something he did often. But when he returned home that day, he noticed something curious. The dog's fur and his own clothing were covered with small burrs, tiny seed pods from the burdock plant. This was not unusual. Anyone who had spent time in nature knew how stubbornly burrs clung to fabrics and animal fur. Most would brush them off and move on. But de Mestral was not most people. He was a methodical thinker, a man trained to investigate the patterns behind everyday phenomena. Instead of ignoring the burrs, he took one and placed it under his microscope. What he saw changed his life and eventually modern clothing and industry. The burr, under magnification, revealed a complex natural structure. Hundreds of tiny hooks that latched onto the loops in the fabric of his pants and the fibers of his dog's coat. It was a simple but effective mechanism, evolved by nature to help the seed pod spread. The burr latched on and stayed attached until brushed off or carried far enough to find fertile ground. De Mestral was struck by the elegance of the design. Here was a naturally occurring fastening system, durable and reusable. What if something similar could be recreated synthetically? The idea seemed simple, but turning it into a manufactured product would take over a decade of experimentation. He began working on prototypes, trying to mimic the hook and loop mechanism using materials available in the 1940s. His early attempts were met with failure. Creating synthetic hooks that were strong enough to latch, yet flexible enough to release, was no easy task. And the loops needed to be just the right density and consistency. For years, he struggled to find the right material and manufacturing process. Traditional weaving methods could not produce the microscopic hooks he needed. Eventually, he discovered that nylon, a relatively new synthetic fiber at the time, could be manipulated under heat to form stiff, hook-like shapes. By cutting nylon into loops and then trimming and shaping them precisely, he was able to replicate the behavior of the burr. But even with a working prototype, he faced skepticism. Many in the textile industry dismissed the invention as impractical or unappealing. It lacked the elegance of buttons or the reliability of zippers. Some found the sound, the sharp ripping noise as the hooks detached from the loops, unpleasant. Still, de Mestral persisted. He named his invention Velcro, a blend of the French words velour, velvet, and crochet hook. In 1955, he patented the invention, and shortly after began producing Velcro commercially. The early manufacturing process was slow and expensive. Machines had to be designed from scratch to cut, shape, and align the hooks and loops in precise configurations. But by the late 1950s and early 1960s, improvements in automation began to make mass production feasible. Velcro found its first major success not in fashion, but in aerospace. NASA engineers, constantly searching for materials that would function in zero gravity, saw the potential. In space, where buttons and zippers could be cumbersome, Velcro offered a quick, secure way to fasten objects and clothing. It became standard in spacesuits, equipment belts, and interior spacecraft design. This unexpected validation from the space industry sparked renewed interest. Soon, Velcro began appearing in ski gear, medical equipment, and children's shoes. The fastener's ease of use, no tying, no threading, no complicated mechanics, made it ideal for people with disabilities, for emergency responders, and for industrial settings where gloves and speed limited dexterity. Over time, Velcro transformed the way we think about fastening. It moved from a novel invention to a silent standard. Hidden in sneakers, securing blood pressure cuffs, keeping remote controls attached to the wall, Velcro became ubiquitous. Yet its origin remained as quiet and humble as the man who created it. George de Mestral never marketed himself as a revolutionary inventor. He simply observed a problem, noticed how nature had solved it, and committed himself to replicating that solution with human tools. He died in 1990, but by that time, Velcro had become a global brand and a staple of modern design. And it all began with a small, persistent burr, a plant's way of traveling through the world, and one man's decision to stop, look closer, and wonder how it worked. Post-it notes. In the early 1970s, deep within the laboratories of the American company 3M, a chemist named Spencer Silver was working on a project that, at the time, seemed to lead nowhere. He was attempting to develop a powerful adhesive, something strong, something industrial. But what he ended up with was the opposite. A weak, pressure-sensitive adhesive that could stick lightly to surfaces but peel off easily, leaving no residue. It was not what anyone at 3M had asked for. In a company known for its high-performance adhesives, a glue that barely stuck seemed like a failure. Silver, however, was intrigued. The adhesive wasn't useless, it was simply different. Could be applied and removed multiple times, over and over, without losing its tack. For most of the scientific community at the time, this feature wasn't useful. But Silver believed it had potential. For years, he promoted the adhesive internally at 3M, holding seminars and offering samples, hoping that someone might find a practical application. But nothing came of it. Engineers and developers were unimpressed. The invention seemed like a solution in search of a problem. That problem would finally be discovered by another 3M employee, Art Fry, a product developer and church choir singer. Every Sunday, Fry sang from a hymnal during rehearsals. Like many others, he used small slips of paper to mark important pages, and like many others, he was frustrated when those slips fell out. One day, during a rehearsal, he remembered Silver's seminar about the reusable adhesive. What if, Fry wondered, he could apply that adhesive to bookmarks? something that would stay in place but not damage the paper when removed. The idea was simple. He went back to the lab and began experimenting with small squares of paper, coating the back with silver's adhesive. The result was a kind of paper that could be stuck lightly to surfaces and repositioned as needed. It didn't fall out and it didn't tear the page. It worked. Fry refined the prototype with help from Silver and other colleagues. Eventually, they created a pad of these papers, square, with a strip of adhesive on the back. They could be peeled off one at a time, used to leave notes, reminders, or page markers, and removed without a trace. It was a quiet, almost humble tool. But it filled a niche no one had realized was empty. Convincing 3M to bring it to market, however, was not easy. Management was unsure if anyone would actually buy small sticky papers. So they tested the product in a single city, Boise, Idaho, in 1977. Samples were handed out for free, and the response was overwhelming. People didn't just use them, they came back asking for more. The feedback was so strong that 3M officially launched the product nationwide in 1980 under the name Post-it Notes. The name was simple. The impact was anything but. Offices, schools, laboratories all adopted the tool. It became a staple of modern communication, organization, and creative thinking. Designers used them for storyboarding. Managers used them for meetings. Writers used them to outline ideas. Scientists used them to track samples. The physicality, the flexibility, the tactile quality of Post-it notes made them uniquely useful, even in a world that would soon go digital. Ironically, the accidental adhesive, the one that was too weak to be useful, had found its perfect purpose. The very qualities that made it unsuitable for traditional use became its greatest strengths. Temporary, reusable, clean, and non-destructive. Spencer Silver and Art Fry were later recognized as co-inventors. Their collaboration, rooted in persistence, serendipity, and a willingness to see value in imperfection, became one of the defining innovation stories of the 20th century. Neither of them had planned to create a global office supply icon, but by observing real-world needs and trusting the accidental utility of a failed product, they transformed the everyday habits of millions. Today, Post-it notes exist in dozens of colors, shapes, and sizes. Though alternatives have emerged, few carry the same symbolic weight. A yellow square stuck to a computer monitor or a refrigerator door still evokes a sense of intention. A note left behind, a thought captured in the moment. A small invention, born from an adhesive that wasn't supposed to work, became one of the quiet engines of human organization. Pacemaker. In the 1950s, medical science was rapidly advancing. Antibiotics had become widespread, surgical techniques were improving, and electricity was increasingly being explored as a tool for treating the human body. Amid these developments, one of the most transformative devices in modern medicine was born, not through intentional design, but through an unexpected accident in a laboratory. The story begins with Wilson Greatbatch, an American engineer and professor with a background in electronics and a growing interest in biomedical applications. At the time, he was working on a device intended to record faint electrical signals from the human heart. Understanding those signals was crucial for diagnosing cardiac conditions. His goal was to create a small, efficient circuit that could amplify and log those impulses for study. In 1956, while assembling the prototype, Greatbatch reached for a resistor, a common component used to control electrical current. But instead of the 10,000-ohm resistor his design called for, he accidentally installed a 1 megohm resistor. The circuit was completed, but something unexpected happened. Rather than recording heart signals, the device began to emit them, producing a rhythmic electrical pulse. It wasn't constant. It came in steady, repeating intervals, mimicking the pattern of a human heartbeat. Greatbatch immediately recognized what he had stumbled upon. This circuit, though assembled incorrectly, could be the foundation for something far greater than a diagnostic tool. What he had accidentally built was the heart of a pacemaker, a device that could regulate the electrical rhythm of a failing heart by sending pulses at precise intervals. At the time, pacemakers did exist, but they were bulky, external machines, often powered by wall current and connected to the patient through electrodes taped to the skin or inserted through open wounds. They were effective only in hospital settings, and even then, their use was limited. The idea of an implantable pacemaker, small, portable, and battery-powered, was still only a vision. Great Batch saw the potential immediately. Working with Dr. William Chardak and Dr. Andrew Gage at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Buffalo, New York, he began to develop a functioning, implantable prototype. The challenges were enormous. Biocompatibility, long-term power supply, miniaturization, and safety all had to be addressed. He encased his circuit in epoxy resin, sealing it against body fluids. For the power source, he used a small mercury zinc battery. The device was roughly the size of a cigarette pack, much larger than modern pacemakers but revolutionary for its time. After extensive animal testing, the first human implantation was performed in 1960. The patient was a 77-year-old man with complete heart block, a condition in which the heart's natural electrical signals do not travel properly through the cardiac tissue, leading to dangerously slow heartbeats or complete pauses. The implanted pacemaker took over, delivering steady impulses that maintained his circulation. The operation was a success. The man lived another 18 months, far longer than expected for someone with his condition. Word of the breakthrough spread quickly. Soon, more devices were implanted. Improvements followed. Smaller designs, longer-lasting batteries, more precise circuitry. But the basic concept, a device that mimics the body's electrical rhythm to keep the heart beating, remained rooted in that accidental resistor. The modern pacemaker has evolved into a marvel of biomedical engineering. Today's devices are smaller than a matchbox, capable of adjusting their pacing in response to physical activity, and can last for more than a decade without replacement. Some models communicate wirelessly with external monitors. Yet they all descend from that first accidental pulse generated in Wilson Greatbatch's lab. By the time of his death in 2011, Greatbatch held over 300 patents, many in the field of medical devices. But it was the pacemaker that remained his most impactful invention. He never forgot that the discovery had come not through a moment of genius, but through a simple mistake, the wrong resistor pulled from a drawer. It is a quiet reminder that the path to innovation is rarely direct. Accidents, when met with insight and persistence, can lead to discoveries that extend life itself. Teflon. In April 1938, in a laboratory at DuPont's Jackson Research Facility in New Jersey, a chemist named Roy Plunkett was conducting routine experiments. He was working with gases related to refrigerants, substances used in cooling systems that were then becoming vital to household refrigeration and air conditioning. The work was technical, repetitive, and often uneventful, the kind of task where unexpected discoveries are rare. But what happened that day would go on to transform everything from aerospace engineering to the humble kitchen frying pan. Plunkett's goal was to create a non-toxic, non-flammable refrigerant by experimenting with tetrafluoroethylene gas, TFE. He stored the gas in small pressurized cylinders, cooled to extremely low temperatures to keep it stable. On that particular morning, he and his assistant prepared one of the cylinders to release its contents into a reaction chamber. But when they opened the valve, nothing came out. The gas had vanished. At first, they suspected a leak, but the cylinder still weighed the same. Whatever had happened to the gas had occurred inside the container. Curious, Plunkett cut the cylinder open. What he found inside was a strange white, waxy powder lining the inner walls of the tank. It was odorless, slippery to the touch, and unlike anything he had seen before. Most importantly, it was completely inert. It didn't react with other chemicals, it didn't corrode, it didn't dissolve in solvents. Further analysis revealed that the gas had polymerized spontaneously, forming a new substance, polytetrafluoroethylene, or PTFE. At the time, no one understood the full significance of the discovery. But over the coming months, Plunkett and his team studied the new material in detail. PTFE was incredibly stable, resistant to heat, cold, chemicals, and moisture. Its surface was so smooth that nothing seemed to stick to it. It had the lowest coefficient of friction of any known solid. DuPont recognized the potential, but it took several years before PTFE found its first applications. In 1945, DuPont registered it under the trademark Teflon. The early uses were highly specialized. Because PTFE resisted chemical corrosion, it was ideal for seals, gaskets, and coatings in military and industrial equipment. During the Manhattan Project, the secret U.S. program to develop the atomic bomb, Teflon was used to coat valves and pipes handling uranium hexafluoride, a highly reactive compound. No other material could withstand the conditions. In the post-war era, as industries expanded, engineers and scientists began exploring more commercial uses for Teflon. One of the most unexpected and most famous came in the 1950s in France. A French engineer named Marc Gregoire had been experimenting with Teflon to reduce friction on fishing lines. At his wife's suggestion, he applied it to the surface of a frying pan. The result was revolutionary. Food no longer stuck. The non-stick frying pan was born. In 1954, the couple began selling the product under the brand Tefal, a blend of Teflon and aluminum. By the 1960s, non-stick cookware had become a global sensation. For home cooks, it meant less oil, easier cleaning, and a significant step forward in convenience. But Teflon's impact extended far beyond the kitchen. Its thermal stability and low friction made it essential in the aerospace industry. It was used in spacecraft wiring, fuel lines, and insulation. NASA employed it in spacesuits and the mechanisms of satellites. Its resistance to biological contamination made it ideal for medical implants, surgical instruments, and tubing in hospitals. Teflon-coated catheters, for instance, reduced infections and improved safety. In electronics, Teflon became indispensable in the insulation of high-frequency cables and connectors. It helped computers operate at higher speeds and with greater reliability. In the automotive industry, it found use in gaskets, bearings, and transmission systems. The success of Teflon was not without controversy. In later years, concerns emerged over PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, a chemical used in the production of Teflon. Though not present in the final product, PFOA was linked to environmental and health issues during manufacturing. In response, DuPont and other producers phased out its use by the mid-2010s, and modern Teflon products are now manufactured without it. Still, the core material PTFE remains one of the most versatile and enduring substances discovered in the 20th century. It is found in homes, hospitals, satellites, engines, and factories. Its utility crosses disciplines, continents, and generations. Roy Plunkett never intended to create a new class of materials. His focus was refrigerants, a practical, narrow goal. But the cylinder that refused to release its contents led him down an entirely different path. He later said that the discovery of Teflon was not the result of inspiration, but of keeping one's eyes open. It was an accident, yes, but one recognized for what it was. Today, Teflon is a quiet presence in daily life. It coats surfaces, protects systems, reduces wear. It allows machines to run longer, cooks to work cleaner, and technologies to reach further. It is one of those rare inventions that, once made, seems almost inevitable, as if it had always been waiting to be discovered. Penicillin. In the late summer of 1928, in a cluttered laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming was returning from a 2-week vacation. His workspace, like many others in microbiology at the time, was filled with open petri dishes, used to culture Staphylococcus bacteria, a common and sometimes dangerous pathogen. The work was routine. Fleming was studying ways to combat bacterial infections, which were often deadly even in minor wounds. At that time, medicine had little defense against bacterial diseases. Infections such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, and septicemia claimed countless lives. Antiseptics existed, but they were harsh and often ineffective once bacteria had entered the bloodstream. On the morning of September 3rd, Fleming began sorting through the plates he had left unattended during his vacation. As he examined one dish, he noticed something unusual. A patch of blue-green mold had contaminated the culture. This in itself was not surprising. Mold contamination was common in any non-sterile lab environment. What stood out was the halo of clarity surrounding the mold. The Staphylococcus colonies had been destroyed in a wide ring around it. Fleming looked closer. Where the mold had grown, the bacteria had vanished. The effect was precise and unmistakable. The mold was killing the bacteria. He isolated the contaminating organism and identified it as a strain of Penicillium notatum. Further tests confirmed his suspicion. The mold secreted a substance that inhibited the growth of many harmful bacteria. He named this substance penicillin. Fleming's initial results were promising. He found that penicillin was non-toxic to human cells but lethal to a wide range of bacteria. However, isolating and purifying the substance proved difficult. The compound was fragile, unstable, and hard to extract in significant quantities. Fleming lacked both the tools and the resources to develop it further. He published his findings in 1929 in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology. The article attracted little attention. For nearly a decade, penicillin remained a scientific curiosity, a footnote in bacteriology, rather than a practical tool. That began to change in the late 1930s, when a team of researchers at the University of Oxford, Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and Norman Heatley, took interest in Fleming's work. They recognized penicillin's potential and launched an ambitious effort to isolate and mass-produce it. Chain developed new purification techniques, while Florey led animal and human trials. The results were astonishing. Penicillin rapidly cleared otherwise fatal infections in mice, and soon after, in critically ill patients. The first successful human treatment occurred in 1941. A man suffering from a severe blood infection began to recover after receiving penicillin, until the supply ran out. He died soon after. The team realized that to save lives, they needed large-scale production. But the war was on, and Britain lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture the drug. Florey and Heatley traveled to the United States, where they partnered with American pharmaceutical companies and government agencies. With the urgency of World War II behind them, efforts accelerated. Scientists screened thousands of mold strains, eventually finding a particularly potent one on a moldy cantaloupe in Peoria, Illinois. By 1944, penicillin was being mass-produced and distributed to Allied troops. It drastically reduced battlefield deaths from infected wounds and saved countless lives. After the war, it became available to civilians, ushering in the antibiotic era, a turning point in medical history. Diseases that had once been death sentences could now be treated with a simple injection. Child mortality dropped. Surgical outcomes improved. Life expectancy rose. The discovery of penicillin transformed not only medicine but also society. It changed the way doctors practiced, how hospitals operated, and how people thought about disease and recovery. Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1945. Fleming remained modest about his role. He often emphasized that many great discoveries come not from genius, but from recognizing the importance of the unexpected. When I woke up just after dawn on September 28, 1928, he once wrote, I certainly didn't plan to revolutionize all medicine by discovering the world's first antibiotic. The story of penicillin is not just about the power of mold, but about observation, persistence, and collaboration. A forgotten petri dish, a ring of dead bacteria, and the instinct to investigate. These simple elements led to one of the most important medical breakthroughs of the 20th century. Today, penicillin and its derivatives remain in use, though resistance has made newer antibiotics necessary. But the legacy of that accidental discovery lives on in every hospital, every prescription, every life saved from a once fatal infection. Artificial sweeteners. In the fall of 1879, at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, a young Russian-born chemist named Konstantin Fahlberg was working late into the evening. He had been studying the chemical composition of coal tar derivatives under the supervision of Professor Ira Remsen. Their research focused on the molecular behavior of substituted benzoic sulfonic acids, a subject with no obvious connection to food, let alone sweetness. After hours in the lab, Fahlberg returned home for dinner. As he began eating, he noticed something strange. The bread tasted sweet. So did his utensils. Even his napkin carried a sugary flavor. It was not the meal, it was his hands. He had forgotten to wash them properly after the day's experiments. Realizing this, he rushed back to the laboratory. He began tasting carefully and deliberately every beaker and flask he had worked with. One of them, containing a substance formed during a particular reaction sequence, produced the same unmistakable sweetness. That compound would later be identified as saccharin, the world's first artificial sweetener. Unlike sugar, saccharin had no calories. It was chemically distinct and orders of magnitude sweeter. Even in tiny amounts, it could deliver an intense sweetness. Fahlberg quickly recognized the commercial potential. Without informing his academic advisor, he patented the compound and began marketing it as a sugar substitute. The move caused tension between Fahlberg and Remsen, who felt that the discovery belonged to their shared laboratory. Still, Fahlberg would go on to make a small fortune from his new product. Initially, saccharin was viewed with skepticism. Its synthetic origin, metallic aftertaste, and unfamiliar name kept it on the fringes of public acceptance. But as sugar prices fluctuated and health concerns around diabetes and obesity began to grow, interest in calorie-free alternatives increased. By the early 20th century, saccharin was being used in small quantities in food products. During both World Wars, sugar shortages prompted broader adoption. With real sugar in short supply, artificial sweeteners became an affordable and stable alternative. Government agencies investigated its safety, but no conclusive risks were found at the time. The turning point in the artificial sweetener story came decades later, with the discovery of other synthetic compounds, many of them, like saccharin, the result of accidental laboratory exposure. In 1937, a graduate student named Michael Svita was working on antipyretic compounds at the University of Illinois. As he smoked a cigarette in the lab, a common habit at the time, he noticed a sweet taste on his lips. The substance he had just synthesized had transferred to the cigarette paper. The compound was cyclamate, another calorie-free sweetener. Svita patented it, and it soon became a common additive in diet sodas and sugar-free products. Then, in 1965, a chemist named James Schlatter was researching anti-ulcer medications for the company G.D. Searle. While synthesizing a chain of peptides, he accidentally licked his finger to pick up a piece of paper and tasted an unusual sweetness. He had discovered aspartame, a compound 200 times sweeter than sugar. It would go on to become one of the most widely used sweeteners in the world. The pattern was consistent. Accidents in chemical laboratories leading to the discovery of intensely sweet compounds, all structurally unrelated to natural sugars. Over time, the list of artificial and low-calorie sweeteners grew to include acesulfame K, sucralose, neotame, and others. Each had its own story, chemical structure, and unique interaction with the human palate. Most were discovered not through targeted research on food additives, but through unrelated pharmaceutical or chemical investigations, and nearly all were stumbled upon by researchers who noticed something unusual, often after tasting their own work unintentionally. Artificial sweeteners would become a cornerstone of the modern food industry. They enabled the rise of diet sodas, low-calorie desserts, sugar-free chewing gums, and a range of products aimed at diabetics and weight-conscious consumers. Their use also sparked decades of debate about safety, metabolism, and long-term health effects. Regulatory agencies around the world studied them in detail, and while some concerns persisted, most sweeteners were ultimately deemed safe within prescribed limits. Still, the origins of these compounds remain rooted in pure serendipity. None were created by chefs or nutritionists. They came from chemical benches, glassware, and late nights in laboratories where the goal was never sweetness. And yet, through observation, accident, and curiosity, sweetness was exactly what was found. Today, artificial sweeteners are both common and controversial. They are praised for their utility and condemned by some for their artificiality. But regardless of opinion, their presence is undeniable. In every sugar-free soda, in every pink or yellow or blue packet at a coffee shop, lies the legacy of chance. What began with coal tar and unwashed hands evolved into one of the most impactful and accidental revolutions in food history. Matches. In the early 19th century, the process of creating fire was still laborious. Most households relied on flint, steel, and tinder, a method that had changed little for centuries. Lighting a fire required skill and patience, and even a simple candle could take minutes to ignite. There were no lighters, no convenient sources of instant flame. Fire was still, in many ways, a primitive and demanding element. But that began to change in 1826, in the town of Stockton-on-Tees in northern England. There, a pharmacist named John Walker was working in his small laboratory, experimenting with chemicals for medical and scientific use. Among the mixtures he prepared were combinations of potassium chlorate, antimony sulfide, and various organic substances, highly reactive materials that, when combined, could produce controlled combustion. Walker had no intention of inventing a tool for fire. He was preparing a new kind of chemical paste, possibly intended for use as an explosive compound or as part of ignition for firearms. One day, while mixing a batch of this paste, he used a small wooden stick to stir the contents. After finishing, he left the stick aside to dry. Later, he attempted to clean it by scraping the tip against the stone floor of his lab. In that moment, the dried compound at the end of the stick ignited suddenly with a sharp flash and a puff of smoke. Walker paused, realizing what had happened. He had created a self-contained fire starter, a small wooden splint coated with a reactive compound that could ignite with friction. No flint, no steel, no elaborate tinderbox. Just a simple strike and fire appeared. Recognizing the practical value of what he had discovered, Walker began producing these fire sticks by hand. He dipped wooden splints into his chemical mixture and sold them in boxes, complete with a rough strip of sandpaper to strike them against. He called them friction lights. In 1827, he began selling them at his pharmacy for public use. They were an immediate curiosity, not only easier to use than traditional methods but also portable and reliable. For the first time, fire could be carried in a pocket, ready on demand. However, Walker never patented his invention. Whether out of humility, disinterest, or lack of foresight, he allowed the idea to spread freely. This left the door open for others to improve upon and commercialize the concept. One of the first to capitalize on Walker's discovery was Samuel Jones, a London entrepreneur who began selling a similar product under the name Lucifers. These matches used the same chemical principles but were manufactured on a larger scale and distributed widely. The term Lucifer, a poetic reference to the bringer of light, became synonymous with early matches. Despite their convenience, the first matches had flaws. They produced harsh fumes, often containing sulfur and phosphorus compounds that emitted an acrid, choking smell. Worse, they could ignite unpredictably or break apart while burning. Accidental fires and burns were common. Throughout the 19th century, chemists worked to improve safety and reliability. The biggest breakthrough came with the development of safety matches. Invented in the 1840s by Swedish chemist Gustav Erik Pask and later perfected by Johann Edvard Lundström. The key innovation was separating the reactive chemicals. The matchstick contained potassium chlorate, while the striking surface on the matchbox held red phosphorus. Only by friction between the two would ignition occur, reducing the risk of accidental combustion. This innovation made matches vastly safer and easier to store. By the late 19th century, safety matches had become a global product. Factories across Europe and the United States mass-produced them by the millions. Matchbooks, matchboxes, and branded match covers became everyday items, used in homes, factories, trains, restaurants, and war zones. The social impact of the matchstick was profound. It democratized fire. No longer the domain of ritual, complexity, or careful preparation, fire became an instant tool. It warmed homes, lit lanterns, sparked engines, and ignited stoves. It enabled modern cooking, industry, and infrastructure. For much of the 20th century, matches remained a household staple. They were found in drawers, purses, pockets, and hotel rooms. Their simple design, wood, chemicals, paper, belied their importance. In the hands of a smoker, a mechanic, or a soldier, they were a symbol of readiness and independence. Though later eclipsed by the invention of the butane lighter and electric ignition systems, matches continue to serve where simplicity matters. In camping gear, survival kits, and emergency drawers. And even now, the match retains a kind of quiet dignity, a reminder of a time when fire was both necessary and elusive. It all began with a chemical experiment, an unintended reaction, and the scrape of a stick across a stone floor. Anesthesia. For much of human history, surgery was a last resort. The absence of pain relief meant that even minor operations were ordeals of unimaginable suffering. Patients were tied down, held still by force, and often operated on fully conscious. Surgeons were trained to be fast, not precise, because speed was the only mercy they could offer. Pain was not just a symptom of injury. It was an inseparable part of medicine itself. That began to change, not through design but through observation and accident. In the early 19th century, two seemingly unrelated substances were becoming popular in public gatherings: nitrous oxide, laughing gas, and ether. They were used recreationally, often in traveling shows or private parties. Guests would inhale the vapors and fall into fits of laughter or stupor. These substances altered perception, caused disorientation, and sometimes made people stumble, fall, or injure themselves without noticing the pain. It was this curious detail that drew the attention of a Connecticut dentist named Horace Wells. In 1844, Wells attended a demonstration of nitrous oxide in Hartford. A volunteer from the audience inhaled the gas and, in his euphoric state, accidentally injured his leg. But he didn't react, didn't even seem to feel it. Wells was struck by this. If nitrous oxide could suppress pain even temporarily, could it be used during tooth extraction? The next day, he arranged an experiment. He inhaled the gas himself and asked a colleague to extract one of his molars. The procedure was completed, and Wells felt no pain. It was a turning point, the first recorded painless surgery under chemical influence. Wells began using nitrous oxide on his patients, and his results were encouraging. But when he attempted to demonstrate the technique publicly in Boston, the gas was poorly administered, and the patient cried out in pain. The audience jeered. Wells' reputation collapsed, and he soon abandoned the profession, dying tragically only a few years later. Yet the idea had taken root. Meanwhile, another dentist, William Morton, a former student of Wells, began experimenting with a different substance: ether. Unlike nitrous oxide, ether had a slower onset and more reliable sedation. It was also easier to control with proper dosing. Working with a surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital, Morton arranged a public demonstration. On October 16, 1846, in the hospital's operating theater, now known as the Ether Dome, Morton administered ether to a young man undergoing neck surgery. The patient remained unconscious. The operation proceeded without distress. When it was complete, the surgeon turned to the audience and declared, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." The event marked the beginning of modern anesthesia. Morton sought to patent his discovery, but controversy quickly followed. He attempted to keep the chemical formula secret and marketed it under the name lithion. However, other physicians quickly identified the active ingredient as simple sulfuric ether, a compound known for over a century. His attempt at exclusivity failed, and the technique spread rapidly. While ether gained popularity, nitrous oxide continued to be used, especially in dentistry. In time, a third substance entered the scene: chloroform. First employed by Scottish obstetrician James Young Simpson in 1847, chloroform had a milder odor and faster onset than ether. It soon became the anesthetic of choice in Britain. Even Queen Victoria used it during the birth of her 8th child. But as more cases emerged, so did complications. Ether could cause irritation of the lungs and postoperative nausea. Chloroform, while pleasant to inhale, carried the risk of sudden cardiac death. There were fatalities. The early years of anesthesia were marked by a delicate balance. Too little, and the patient would awaken in agony. Too much, and the patient might never awaken at all. Despite these dangers, the value of anesthesia was undeniable. For the first time in human history, surgeons could operate without the pressure of speed. They could be deliberate. They could explore. Complex internal surgeries became possible. Medical training evolved. Hospitals transformed from places of palliative care to centers of intervention and recovery. As chemistry advanced, safer and more refined anesthetic agents emerged. Inhaled gases gave way to intravenous anesthesia in the 20th century. Drugs like thiopental, propofol, and ketamine allowed doctors to induce unconsciousness with precision and maintain it with stability. Monitoring technology improved, helping anesthesiologists control dosage in real time and ensure patient safety. Today, anesthesia is a sophisticated medical discipline. Anesthesiologists are trained not only to administer drugs, but also to manage breathing, circulation, and neurological function during surgery. The risks, though still present, are minimal in most cases. Millions of operations are performed each year with anesthesia as a silent partner, guiding the body through trauma without conscious suffering. And yet, at its heart, the story of anesthesia began with a public demonstration, a toothache, and a misstep on a gas-filled stage. It was not born in a deliberate quest to conquer pain, but in the accidental observation that pain might be avoided altogether. What followed was a revolution, not loud or dramatic, but quiet, clinical, and profound. In removing pain from surgery, anesthesia reshaped not just medicine, but the way we think about the body, the mind, and the boundary between consciousness and silence. Vulcanized rubber. In the early 19th century, rubber was both a marvel and a problem. Known to European scientists since the late 1700s, this elastic substance, derived from the sap of tropical trees, seemed full of promise. Could stretch and return to shape, repel water, and form seals. But it had a critical flaw: instability. In cold weather, rubber became rigid and brittle. In heat, it melted into a sticky, foul-smelling goo. Products made from it, shoes, coats, balls, would stiffen in the winter and decompose in the summer. Despite its potential, rubber was largely impractical for widespread use. Inventors across Europe and America tried to solve the problem, often using mixtures of rubber with other substances like sulfur or turpentine. None succeeded until a man named Charles Goodyear, driven by both obsession and misfortune, stumbled upon the answer. Goodyear was not a chemist by training. Born in 1800 in New Haven, Connecticut, he had worked in hardware and failed at business more than once. But in the 1830s, he became fascinated with rubber. He believed it was the material of the future, capable of revolutionizing manufacturing, waterproofing, and even transportation. Unfortunately, he became consumed by this belief, to the detriment of his finances and reputation. Despite being repeatedly jailed for debt, Goodyear persisted. He experimented with different treatments, blending rubber with magnesia, acids, oils, and eventually sulfur, a substance others had tried without much success. He worked in borrowed kitchens, basements, and sheds. His children helped stir mixtures. His wife pawned household items to keep them fed. Then, in 1839, while in Woburn, Massachusetts, something unexpected happened. Goodyear had been working with a new blend of rubber and sulfur. One day, as he stood near a hot stove, a lump of the mixture accidentally fell onto the surface. Instead of melting or burning, the rubber hardened, but it didn't become brittle. It remained elastic, yet firm. Even more remarkably, when it cooled, it retained the stable form. The sticky, fragile rubber had been transformed into something durable, flexible, and resistant to temperature changes. Goodyear had just discovered vulcanization, though he didn't call it that yet. It was the first reliable method for stabilizing rubber. The name would come later, inspired by Vulcan, the Roman god of fire, in recognition of the heat required to trigger the chemical reaction. At the heart of vulcanization was cross-linking. The sulfur atoms formed bridges between long rubber molecules, locking them into a matrix that prevented slippage at high temperatures and brittleness at low ones. The result was a thermostable material, the rubber we now know as industrial grade. Goodyear immediately recognized the significance of what he had found. He improved the process through trial and error, refining temperatures and sulfur concentrations. But despite the brilliance of his invention, commercial success eluded him. He lacked business acumen, and legal protections were tenuous in that era. In 1844, Goodyear finally secured a U.S. patent for the vulcanization process. However, that same year, another inventor, Thomas Hancock in England, obtained a British patent for a similar process, possibly based on samples Goodyear had sent abroad. Legal disputes followed. Goodyear spent years in court defending his invention, often at great personal cost. He never became wealthy. He lived modestly, pouring any income into further experiments and lawsuits. When he died in 1860, he was heavily in debt. But his invention endured. The impact of vulcanized rubber was immense. It transformed rubber from a novelty into a foundation of modern industry. Suddenly, rubber could be used in belts, hoses, seals, shoes, waterproof clothing, machine parts, and later pneumatic tires, a technology that would power the transportation revolution of the 20th century. In medicine, vulcanized rubber led to reliable tubing and surgical gloves. In plumbing and engineering, it provided leak-proof seals. In electrical systems, it became a durable insulator. Everywhere rubber was needed, from the soles of boots to the inner workings of engines, vulcanization made it possible. The company that would later bear Goodyear's name, the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, was founded in 1898, 38 years after his death. Though Goodyear had no connection to the firm, the name was chosen to honor his contribution. Today, vulcanized rubber is so common it's often invisible. Beneath floors, inside machines, along roads, wrapped around wires. It bends, seals, cushions, and connects. And all of it began with a mistake. A lump of rubber dropped on a stove. Goodyear once wrote, "Life should not be estimated exclusively by the standard of dollars and cents." His invention proved that, though he lived in poverty, the world he left behind was richer, made more flexible, more durable, and more mobile by the material he gave it. Slinky. In the middle of the 1940s, as World War II reached its climax, engineers across the United States were working on advanced technologies for the military. One such engineer, Richard James, was stationed at the Cramp shipyard in Philadelphia. His job was to develop new ways to stabilize sensitive instruments aboard naval vessels, particularly gyroscopes and other devices used for navigation. One persistent challenge was vibration. Ships, especially during combat or rough seas, experienced constant movement. Instruments needed to remain steady, and engineers experimented with various shock-absorbing mechanisms to cushion them. James was experimenting with torsion springs, tightly wound coils of steel designed to absorb kinetic energy. One day, while working at his bench, he accidentally knocked a spring off the table. What happened next was unexpected. Instead of dropping straight down, the spring tumbled end over end, as if walking down to the floor. It continued in a smooth, controlled motion until it came to rest. It was graceful, even mesmerizing. James paused. The coil hadn't just fallen. It had transitioned energy through itself, step by step, in a rhythmic cascade. It seemed to move with a kind of natural intelligence, balancing between tension and release. In that moment, the engineer inside him stepped aside, and the inventor took over. He took the spring home and showed it to his wife, Betty James. She immediately saw what he had seen. This wasn't just a tool. It could be a toy. Something about the movement was playful, novel, and oddly soothing. Children would love it. Betty encouraged Richard to pursue the idea. They began experimenting with different gauges of steel, trying to find the right balance between weight, tension, and flexibility. After many trials, they settled on a spring made from high-carbon blue-black steel, about 65 feet long when fully extended but tightly wound into a compact form. Now, they needed a name. Betty combed through the dictionary, searching for something that captured the toy's elegant motion. She found a Swedish-derived word, slinky, meaning sleek, sinuous, graceful. It was perfect. In 1945, the Jameses borrowed $500 and had 400 Slinkies manufactured. But they still needed a way to introduce the product to the public. Richard arranged a live demonstration at Gimbel's department store in Philadelphia, just before Christmas. The reaction was immediate. As Slinkies walked down inclined platforms, stairs, and display stands, children gathered, wide-eyed. Within minutes, the entire batch sold out. Parents and kids alike were captivated by the toy's seemingly magical motion. It moved without batteries, made no sound, and didn't require explanation. Simply worked and entertained. By the following year, the Jameses had founded James Industries, and production scaled up. Throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the Slinky became one of America's most iconic toys. It appeared in advertisements, toy fairs, and even science classrooms. Its movement helped demonstrate principles of energy transfer, gravity, and wave motion. Teachers found it useful. Kids found it hypnotic. But the story of Slinky wasn't without turbulence. In the early 1960s, Richard James underwent a personal transformation. He became involved in a religious movement and made the unexpected decision to leave his family and business behind. He moved to Bolivia to join a religious mission, leaving the company in disarray. At that moment, the future of the Slinky and the family was uncertain. But Betty James stepped in. She took control of James Industries, stabilized its finances, and reignited public interest in the toy. She moved the company to Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania, and launched a national advertising campaign featuring the now-famous jingle, "It's Slinky, it's Slinky. For fun, it's a wonderful toy." The campaign was a success. Sales surged once again. Betty guided the company for decades, overseeing the production of tens of millions of Slinkies. Under her leadership, the toy didn't just survive. It became a cultural landmark. The Slinky appeared in movies, television shows, and museums. It was inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame. In 1990, a Slinky even flew aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery as part of an experiment to demonstrate how toys behave in microgravity. Despite its fame, the Slinky remains simple. A coil of wire, expertly proportioned. Its magic lies in its motion, an accidental choreography of metal and momentum. There are no batteries, no screens, no complex parts. It is tactile, visual, and kinetic. It obeys gravity and physics, but feels alive. And it all began with a misstep. A spring knocked off a workbench in a shipyard lab. Richard James didn't intend to invent a toy. He was solving a technical problem, chasing stability in a chaotic world. What he found instead was motion, curiosity, and joy. Dynamite. In the mid-19th century, the world was changing rapidly. Industry and infrastructure expanded across continents. Railways pushed through mountains, canals carved through landscapes, and mining operations dug ever deeper into the earth. All of this progress demanded one essential force: controlled explosions. At the time, the primary explosive in use was black powder, a centuries-old mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. It was effective but lacked precision and power. It produced vast clouds of smoke and was dangerously unstable under certain conditions. The growing need for more powerful and reliable explosives led chemists to explore alternatives. In 1847, the Italian chemist Ascanio Sobrero discovered nitroglycerin, a clear, oily liquid made by treating glycerin with nitric and sulfuric acid. It was extremely powerful, several times more energetic than black powder, but it was also violently unstable. Even small movements, vibrations, or changes in temperature could trigger a deadly detonation. Sobrero himself was horrified by its volatility and warned against its use. But not everyone was deterred. Among those who saw potential in nitroglycerin was a young Swedish engineer and chemist named Alfred Nobel. Born in 1833, Nobel was part of a family already immersed in the business of explosives and engineering. His father, Emanuel Nobel, had experimented with underwater mines and taught Alfred the value of invention combined with application. After studying chemistry and working with Sobrero's formula, Alfred Nobel became determined to make nitroglycerin safe to handle and transport. His early efforts were dangerous and tragic. In 1864, an explosion at the family's factory in Stockholm killed several people, including Alfred's younger brother, Emil. Rather than retreat, Nobel intensified his work. He understood the immense value that a stable form of nitroglycerin could bring to industries like mining, construction, and transportation. His approach was not to weaken the compound, but to control it. The breakthrough came in 1867. Nobel discovered that if nitroglycerin was absorbed into a porous material, in this case a type of soft sedimentary rock called kieselguhr, it became far less sensitive to shock. The mixture formed a paste-like substance that could be shaped into rods, packed into drilling holes, and safely handled under normal conditions. When detonated with a blasting cap, another of Nobel's innovations, the mixture released its full power, but only when triggered deliberately. He named this new substance dynamite, from the Greek word dynamis, meaning power. With this invention, Nobel had achieved what had once seemed impossible. He had tamed nitroglycerin. Dynamite was rapidly adopted across the globe. It transformed the construction of railroads, tunnels, dams, and canals. In the United States, it was instrumental in blasting paths through mountains for the Transcontinental Railroad. In Europe, it reshaped cities and enabled engineering feats previously thought unimaginable. Nobel patented dynamite and built factories across Europe and the Americas. He became extraordinarily wealthy, one of the richest men of his time. Yet, despite his success, Nobel remained a reserved and introspective figure. He spoke several languages, wrote poetry, and maintained a lifelong interest in literature and peace. He also felt a growing unease about the uses of his invention. Although dynamite was intended for industrial purposes, it did not take long before it was adopted for military and political violence. Revolutionary groups, anarchists, and armed factions around the world found dynamite to be a convenient tool of destruction. Nobel, though not directly responsible, was deeply affected by the consequences. A pivotal moment came in 1888, when Alfred's brother Ludwig Nobel died in France. A French newspaper mistakenly published an obituary for Alfred instead, titled, "The Merchant of Death is Dead." The article condemned him for profiting from explosives and implied that his legacy would be one of blood and destruction. Nobel was shaken. He had always hoped his inventions would serve peace through progress. Now, he faced the possibility that he would be remembered for creating tools of death. Determined to reshape his legacy, Nobel took a dramatic step. In his will, written shortly before his death in 1896, he directed that his vast fortune be used to establish the Nobel Prizes, awards recognizing those who had conferred the greatest benefit to humanity in the fields of physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. He devoted a specific prize for peace, to be awarded to individuals or organizations working to reduce armaments, promote diplomacy, and end conflict. Through this act, Nobel ensured that his name would be associated not only with dynamite, but also with human progress, intellect, and conscience. Dynamite remains in use today, though it has largely been supplanted by more advanced explosives like ammonium nitrate-based compounds. Still, its legacy persists in every tunnel bored, every highway cut through rock, and every structure made possible by controlled force. The story of dynamite is not one of war, though war found it. It is the story of a chemist seeking control over chaos, transforming one of the world's most dangerous substances into a tool of industry and transformation. Alfred Nobel did not set out to invent violence. He set out to solve a problem. What followed was a chain reaction, both chemical and moral. Corn Flakes. In the final decades of the 19th century, a quiet movement was taking shape in the American Midwest. A health reform wave rooted in the principles of vegetarianism, temperance, and spiritual purity. At the center of this movement was the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan, operated by a physician named Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. Dr. Kellogg was a Seventh-day Adventist and a firm believer in the healing power of diet, exercise, and moderation. At his sanitarium, patients were offered cutting-edge hydrotherapy, lectures on digestion, and most notably, a strict vegetarian diet designed to promote not only physical health but moral discipline. Among the dietary principles he emphasized was the need for bland, easily digestible food meals that wouldn't overstimulate the body or mind. In the kitchens of the sanitarium, Kellogg and his younger brother, Keith Kellogg, experimented constantly with new food preparations. Their goal was to create meatless alternatives, improve digestion, and eliminate spices, caffeine, and sugar. Much of their focus turned toward grains. Around 1894, while developing a digestible bread substitute using wheat, the brothers accidentally left a batch of boiled wheat sitting out too long. The mixture dried and became unusually stiff. Rather than discarding it, they decided to run the hardened dough through rollers, expecting to produce a flat sheet. To their surprise, instead of forming sheets, the wheat broke apart into flakes, thin, crispy, toasted fragments. Curious, they baked the flakes and tasted them. The result was unexpectedly pleasant. Light, crisp, and unlike anything else being served at the time. They offered the flakes to the sanitarium's patients, who immediately responded with enthusiasm. The food was easy to eat, agreeable on the stomach, and even enjoyable despite its blandness. Encouraged by the response, the Kellogg's refined their process and began serving the product regularly at Battle Creek. Dr. Kellogg, committed to health reform, saw the flakes strictly as a therapeutic food medicine by way of grain. He refused to add sugar or flavorings. Will, on the other hand, recognized a broader opportunity. He believed that if made slightly more palatable, these flakes could appeal to everyday Americans, not just sanitarium guests. He also understood the emerging appetite for convenience foods among a growing urban population. In 1906, against his brother's wishes, Will Keith Kellogg founded the Battle Creek Toasted Corn Flake Company, the business that would become the Kellogg Company. He modified the original recipe, adding a modest amount of sugar, improving the packaging, and launching an aggressive advertising campaign. The product, now known as Kellogg's Corn Flakes, quickly gained popularity. It was shelf-stable, required no preparation, and fit seamlessly into the rhythm of modern life. Within a few years, breakfast in America began to shift from hot, heavy fare like eggs and sausage to cold, dry cereals poured into bowls and doused in milk. The success of Corn Flakes ignited an entire industry. Other entrepreneurs followed, including a former sanitarium patient named C.W. Post, who launched his own line of cereals after observing the Kellogg process. Battle Creek, Michigan became the epicenter of the American breakfast cereal revolution, home to competing factories, innovations in packaging, and national advertising campaigns. Meanwhile, the rift between the Kellogg brothers deepened. Dr. John Kellogg, focused on medical practice and religious values, resented the commercialization of what he saw as a moral food. Will, focused on business, modernized production, invested in national distribution, and eventually took legal control of the family name in food branding. Despite their feud, both contributed to a lasting change in how people eat. Corn Flakes, though born of accident and sustained by innovation, became more than a food. It was one of the first mass-produced, branded breakfast products in the world. It reflected a changing society, one moving toward industrial efficiency, consumer convenience, and daily routines shaped by packaging and marketing. And it all began with a forgotten pot of wheat, the accidental drying, the flaking of the dough, and the serendipitous decision to bake rather than discard gave rise to a food that reshaped mornings for millions. What was intended as a bland, therapeutic dish for digestive purity became a household staple, one that now sits in kitchens across continents, more than a century later. Corn Flakes remind us that invention does not always come from deliberate design. Sometimes it comes from patience, curiosity, and the courage to taste what others might have thrown away. Ending. From safety glass to Corn Flakes, these accidental discoveries remind us that not every world-changing idea begins with a grand plan. Sometimes, it's a spill on a lab bench, a spring falling from a desk, or a forgotten pot of wheat left overnight. Innovation often hides in the unexpected, and history, time and again, proves that even the smallest accidents can shape the future. If you enjoyed this journey through invention and serendipity, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a like, share this video with a curious friend, and let us know in the comments which invention surprised you the most. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.